from the smallest trivial things like being less afraid about taking cookies, to those fears which can sometimes paralyze us to the core. Today's short gospel from Mark paints a scene punctuated by fear. Jesus is in the desert for 40 days without any human companionship. Satan is actively testing him. Jesus is among wild beasts, which are traditional symbols, not so much of animals as they are of temptations. And John the Baptist has been arrested, which underscores the political disorder. While the gospel scene paints a situation which may be scary, our gospel really invites us to see with the eyes of faith. To see with the eyes of faith is not selective viewing, nor is it repression, as if to ignore what may be bad or distracting. It is to see things as they are, or to put it in another way, to see how God sees. Even though Christ is surrounded by darkness and testing, Mark still gives us glimmers of hope to show us how God is still in charge. Jesus is not distracted by Satan, and we hear about angels ministering to Jesus. That even in the state of temptation or testing, God is still active and present. Or in the words of Ignatius, God could still labor in times of darkness or turmoil. Or to put it yet another way, in Barbara Brown Taylor's recent book, she writes that we must learn how not to be afraid of the dark, which can be such a place of fear and foreboding. Instead, we should learn to develop a type of night vision and learn how to walk in the dark, because God can work in the dark too. Taylor notes that there are about 100 references to darkness in the Bible, and almost all of them represent fear. Darkness stands for death, or it happens as the result of God's wrath, or it's a type of ignorance. Light, like candles or sunshine, always stands for Jesus. Certainly, yes. But what we can't forget, as Taylor notes, is that God also works grace at night, in the midst of fear and darkness. God brought Abram out into the night sky in order to teach him that his descendants would be numerous. The Israelites fled from their Egyptian bondage at night. Manna fell from the sky at night. God parted the Red Sea at night. And as we heard in the first reading, it was in the night or in the midst of the storm that Noah and his family came to deepen their trust in God, a trust that had to be patient enough to endure the storm. Most importantly, we hear how God takes the initiative to establish covenant relationship, connection, kinship with his people. In our second reading, Peter reinforces how God has been good and patient through trials and difficulties. So it is good to remember that with God, there is nothing to fear. For those of you who are joining our 9-day novena for the first time, Father Ray and I have been exploring and unpacking Doctors Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's and David Kessler's book, Life Lessons, the title page of which I have Xeroxed and put in the vestibules just in case if you want to pick up a copy and purchase a book on your own at Amazon or at Barnes & Noble for your own Lenten reading. From their work with the dying and the terminally ill, Dr. Kessler has come to suggest some very important lessons about fear. And he says that fear's power is built on an empty foundation, and it can be defeated by stepping forward. Stepping forward. During the Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, our parish bulletin printed one of my favorite quotes for Martin Luther King Jr., which I also used in my homily that day. And it's this: if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, keep moving forward. The act of moving forward, as Dr. King suggests, or stepping forward, as Dr. Kessler suggests, really embodies the courage we need in order to face those demons in life, or to choose against those temptations in life, whether it be speaking in front of a crowd, confronting a person, or even telling your loved one, "I love you." Since Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I flew to Georgia for some business. Then I took a day trip to drive to Selma, Alabama, the place where Martin Luther King Jr. and thousands others marched to Montgomery, which prompted President Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Selma March, the 50th anniversary of which we will celebrate in just a few weeks, has inspired a film in theaters which some of you may have already seen. And what was striking about walking along the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge is that in the context of fighting for voting rights, as King and his contemporaries did 50 years ago, to step forward in the way that King advocated, to step forward and cross that bridge, to leave Selma to Montgomery, would have meant getting a club to the face or a punch to the stomach. So it was beautiful to see in that Selma film at one important point, without giving it away, instead of stepping forward, as they were all planning to do, Martin Luther King, to the surprise and discomfort of many, instead chose to kneel down. Kneel down not as an act of surrender and defeat, but an act of prayer and dependence. For King, conquering fears meant stepping forward in spirit in order to kneel down. And in kneeling down, he placed all in God's hands. So when we find ourselves in fear, whether it be the darkness of night, temptations from voices that do not come from God, economic or political turmoil, any movement that we choose to step forward in courage, to conquer our fears, is done with the Lord at our side.